I certainly have no crystal ball, but I do have a historical knowledge, and one that is based on teaching and 400 or so students on 2 campuses who did case study after case study for me, as well as my own personal experience, which is telescopic to be sure, but these students have added a lot of breadth and depth to my perception. And what I taught was national security decision-making, which in essence was defined by us as decisions that send young men and young women to die for state purposes and often to kill others for state purposes and go from there. One of the things I discovered that I suspected very, very highly, if you will, over a long period of time, at least a decade and a half, was it all started with Bill Clinton. And what I mean by it all started is not that the so-called, and I despise this term now because it covers so much water that it shouldn't cover and doesn't cover a lot of water it should, neoconservatives. We've always had them with us. There's a great little study going on by Rachel Maddox right now about fascism in America. I think she's up to about 1970 now, but it's an eye-opener for anyone who thinks fascism has never courted America. It certainly has. We had a Marine General, Medal of Honor winner, 2 times, Smedley Butler, who went before a congressional committee to tell them that he had been solicited by these people to be their military proxy, as it were. So they've been around a long time, but they really came into government with a vengeance with William Jefferson Clinton. And from that time on, they have been infecting the halls of government in significant and profound ways. And they haven't gone away. They have ebbed and waned to a certain extent, but they have insinuated themselves everywhere. All of this to say that they're still with us and they are infecting the Trump administration in some fundamental ways. Now, what does that mean for Trump? It means that his circus, and that's a term I use carefully, it is a circus. He picked some people for his cabinet who simply have no credentials for their positions. And that circus is being perturbated majorly, principally right now in the Defense Department, the key department, because that's all we care about anymore, is the Defense Department, with Pete Hegseth. He's being attacked mercilessly by these neocons from every angle from which they can approach him. One wonders why, because it seems that most of Hegseth's positions, at least as taken before coming into government, and the few things we know about him since then, are pretty much in line with much of what they want to do. But they apparently do not like him at all. So that's a real problem for Trump right now. Mike Waltz is one. His national security advisor. He picked a national security advisor who is a Victoria Nuland clone. This makes no sense whatsoever. It's why he has a Secretary of State who's named Witkoff, because his Secretary of State is also a dyed-in-the-wool neoconservative. Now, these people have different permutations, and I wouldn't compare Waltz directly with Rubio, but they're both cut from the same cloth. And here's Trump trying to navigate between them, so to speak. One comes to the conclusion quite frequently, as I did while I was fishing and had time to think, Trump's purpose in life must be to destroy this republic, because he has put together, assembled all the ingredients that are necessary for doing that. And he himself is adding to the economic peril every day. So you put those two things together, national security, which has become the dominant field for this republic, I hate to call it a republic, for this empire, and its economy, which has to be behind that military effort, that security effort, in order for it to succeed, and he's destroying both. So you're looking at it and saying, what is this guy doing? Why is he here? What is his purpose? And how do I detect his purpose? And how do I do anything about that purpose if it is as inimical as I think it is? Because it's very difficult.
I was trying to make sense myself of the, Team Trump, the people he put together, because I guess, all of this, everything with politics these days is very polarized, but one can, say objectively that his team doesn't, not all of them have a lot of experience behind them. I guess Pete Hegseth being one of them. So how I was curious how this can be explained because I heard some different explanations. Some argue that well, obviously the competency is, all politics aside, is simply not there. So is it because Trump doesn't care much for? Is it his personality that he doesn't care much for experts? That he prefers, he knows best, so all he needs are loyalists to implement it, or is this like a remnant of the first administration, given that he was fought so hard, the way he sees it, as by the deep state, so the media, his own party, the intelligence agencies. So now he doesn't want anyone from the establishment. He just wants people who will do as they're told. So non-experts, or does it have that rational reason behind it? Not that it makes it much more productive, but or is it just about his personality? I'm not sure if you thought about any of this.
Well, that's actually a good question. I've asked myself that question at periods in the last 30 days in particular, because what you see is lingering remnants that are just beginning to blossom again of the things that plagued Clinton and all the presidents since then. And when they find out that when they bite something, blood runs, they get more enthused and they go after other people. They're after Hegseth right now. Bloodily and mercilessly, they're after Hegseth. So far, Trump has stuck by him, and I can't detect the real reason they're after Hegseth, because to me, it looks like from both pre-cabinet position to cabinet position, short time though that's been, he's pretty much in sync with most of what they want to do, principally the slaughter and genocide in Gaza. And he's probably 100% behind what Trump wants to do with regard to Ukraine. Now, let me back up for a moment and say that one of the components that lingers most viciously is allied with a lot of the national security establishment that isn't necessarily neoconservative. And that's in the commitment to Ukraine. And they are truly angry because people don't understand this. We've been working on Ukraine since my administration with George W. Bush. We've been working on the Europeans to get governments elected that would be conducive to NATO membership in Denmark, in Norway, in Finland, to get secretaries general for NATO that were absolute disciples of America, Jens Stoltenberg being the prominent one, but the next one was pretty much the same way. We've been doing all of that, and now it's come to an abrupt halt with Trump, supposedly. At least he pronounced that it was going to come to an abrupt halt. These people are angrier than a herd of hornets. And so you've got that element that's also really angry, not necessarily neoconservative in the sense that they're card-carrying members like others I could name, but they are incensed over this fact that we are disassembling NATO, disassembling it, and at the same time, we're abandoning the brave cohort of American-like people in Ukraine, this democracy, this liberal democracy in Ukraine, which is all poppycock. But that's the way they conceived it. That's the way they built it. That's the way they pitched it. And now he's looking like he's going to abandon it. And most of all, he's going to abandon their hero, Volodymyr Zelensky. He's going to abandon it. So you got a lot of anger in this lingering element. And a lot of that lingering element with regard to Ukraine's in the CIA. And I don't think for a moment Tulsi Gabbard as DNI is going to be able to, a position removed, going to be able to corral that. And she hadn't corralled it to this point. There are things going on right now that the agency is doing in Ukraine still that Trump doesn't even know about. I almost guarantee you he doesn't know about it. So that's an imperfect explanation of what's going on, but it is a very, very hot bowl of soup with lots of ingredients, and Trump hasn't a clue how to cool it down and eat it. He simply hasn't a clue. I listened to him this morning in an ambush interview, sort of, and he answered a question from a reporter in the audience about recruiting. Well, recruiting is abysmal right now. He came back and said, our Army is great. It's wonderful. Well, I don't know where you got that. Where did you get that? We're recruiting more than we ever have. Oh, blah, blah, blah. That's his answer, basically, to almost any substantive question, that everything's glorious. You're just not aware that it's glorious, so get out of my press pool. That doesn't work. It only works for a short time. Have you seen his disapproval ratings? They're
Yeah, no,
tanking.
it's dropping. No, no,
Yeah,
the approval rating is dropping. That
yeah.
is.
Approval ratings dropping, but I watch the disapproval more than I do the approval because there seems to be a disconnect in the way people poll these. Most of our pollsters, I don't know about yours in Europe, but most of our pollsters poll to prove something. They don't poll to find out what people think. They poll to prove something, and they have their preconceived notion when they do their polling. But the disapproval rating usually doesn't get their attention so much as the approval rating. So the disapproval rating is what I watch, and it's climbing. It's climbing. It's over. I think when I looked last, it was about 52 or 53% and headed up. So I don't know. I don't know if he pays any attention to that. It doesn't look like he does because he will go out and do something that just enhances whatever's happening in a moment. Either tell a lie or do something egregious with the economy. So I don't, I have to say I can't figure the man out. I don't know where he is or what he's going to do on any given day. I know that he started out, and I think the only sane and sober member of the administration in a now, I guess, official special envoy status, he's really the Secretary of State. And I'm sure that I'm quite confident Trump did that on purpose because I don't think he likes Marco Rubio much. So he sort of put Rubio in his place by putting Witkoff in every crisis on the face of the earth virtually. Put him in Gaza, put him in Ukraine, put him in Iran. But he seems to be a stable person, and he seems to think logically. And he seems to have a little bit of wisdom, not much historical knowledge about what he's dealing with, which is a real problem. But nonetheless, he's willing to listen, as was indicated in Muscat the first time and the second time. He's willing to listen, and he doesn't take counsel for Mike Waltz, because Mike Waltz was putting it out that Witkoff was wrong, that nothing he told the Iranians in the first meeting, indirectly, nothing that he told them was right, that we were not going to do anything with Iran but disarm them, completely disarm them. If they didn't want to be completely disarmed, the talks were over. Well, Witkoff went back to the second meeting and didn't pay any attention to that at all. So we're going to have other meetings, apparently. Who knows what's going on, though, between Waltz and Rubio and Witkoff and Trump? Apparently, Witkoff only listens to Trump, and that's probably good. But then you got to ask yourself, what is Trump telling him? Look at Ukraine right now. You have 4 significant issues that they're not really addressing in a logical way. You have the axis inside Ukraine. You have the axis between Kyiv and the EU. You have the axis between Washington and Kyiv. And you have the axis between Ukraine, Kyiv, if you will, and Moscow. You got to deal with all 4 of those components roughly simultaneously. And you've got to take care of all 4 of those components. Well, all Trump seems to be doing, and apparently all Witkoff seems to be doing, is dealing with Putin and letting the other things just run around wherever they will run around. Well, that's not going to work because Putin's not going to sign up to a deal where the other 3 aspects are still perturbating the situation majorly, just because we want a relationship with Moscow. I had a Russian ask me for a comment yesterday, and I essentially said, this is what I would think has to happen. And by the way, at the end of it, you have to have a significant effort that has picked up steam going towards a new security relationship in Europe that includes Russia. I called it a new Euro, whatever you want to call it, Euro-Asian security architecture. I don't like to put Asia in there. I'd rather say a European security architecture that includes Russia. And I don't see a lot of work on that right now, maybe because they realize the other 3 are going to mess it up. But I don't see a lot of work on anything. And Gaza, of course, you want to get sick, watch Ben-Gvir at Mar-a-Lago. Watch Ben-Gvir extol in English at Mar-a-Lago. I love all you people. I just love you people. And what we're doing, you should see how we torture people. You should come to our jails, visit our jails, and see how we torture people. And people are clapping. People are sitting around this luxurious dinner table or whatever it was, and they're clapping. Now, I have to admit, I saw this morning some press reports and watched some video where he's gone around the country trying to do the same thing to audiences at various places in the country, and they've been pillorying him, and they've been throwing eggs at him and things like that. That's what should happen to Ben Gvir. In fact, he should be arrested and turned over to the International Criminal Court. But the administration's got so many irons in the fire and is doing so little strategically about those irons that I don't know where they're going. I simply don't know where they're going. I watched Doug Macgregor on your show a little bit, and I agree with most of what Doug's saying, particularly the negative aspects of it. I don't agree that we had no strategy in World War II. Well, certainly we had a strategy. It was called, we're going to be the arsenal of democracy. And McNair and Marshall and others said, okay, well, that means we're going to have to limit our manpower in the field. And they put a limit on that manpower. And we almost paid for that with the Battle of the Bulge, the counteroffensive in the Ardennes, 1944-45. We took 78,000 casualties there. That was our strategy because we didn't want to take men completely away from the industrial base. We knew we could only make so many divisions and have that industrial base that would supply us, the Free French, the Free Poles, the Soviets massively, and the British. We did that. That was a very successful strategy because look what we did. Joe Stalin knew what we did. We used Russia to defeat Germany, in essence. And then we came ashore and almost lost it in that counteroffensive. Had Hitler gotten what he wanted with Model's Army Group B, if they had gone to Antwerp and taken Antwerp and severed the Canadians and the Brits and the Americans by taking the logistical port of Antwerp, we would have been kicked off the landmass. And that would have been, they might have still lost to the Soviets, but that would have been a hell of a defeat for Roosevelt and for Churchill. And Eisenhower was almost relieved over it because they knew he'd made a big mistake. And that's why we didn't go on to Berlin too, because it's so sour to Eisenhower that he didn't want to go into Berlin and do street fighting. He let the Russians do that. And what did we get? We got the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe and so forth. So it was a flawed strategy, but to say there was no strategy is pure nonsense. George Marshall was Jack Pershing's chief of staff in World War I. We had a strategy in World War I too. It was not to be like the French and the British and use casualties as the mark of success on the battlefield. We didn't want to take massive casualties. Now, did Wilson have a strategy? Yeah, he wanted to make the world safe for democracy, and he was going to do that at Versailles, right? Yeah, right. Well, he didn't do that, and I agree with Doug on that. But let's don't say we didn't have a strategy. We did have a strategy. We don't today. We simply do not today. We have not had a strategic approach to our imperial reign since Bill Clinton. It went away with H.W. Bush, Jim Baker, Dick Cheney, Colin Powell, and the other people in that administration, most formidably Brent Scowcroft, who was a strategic genius. We haven't had that. So we've been absent leadership for decades.
How do you explain, though, the shifts in American presidents? Because during the elections, they all come off as, well, I don't want to dismiss it as not being genuine, but let's, for example, look at Clinton when back in 94, in January of 1994, he was making the argument that, if we expand NATO, we risk redividing Europe and making an enemy out of Russia again. So this would not be a good idea. He went on to do it anyways. And when Bush was elected, I remember the campaign he had. The whole a key thing was, we're not going to do nation building like Clinton did in the Balkans. We don't do nation building. And then of course he takes it on steroids in Afghanistan, Iraq, and
you
then
have to fool the American people. Well, to get elected, you have to fool the American people, or at least that's what both.
So you don't see it as necessarily being genuine, because when, like, again, Obama, I did buy into this when he had this campaign on change. We can't continue after, again, 2 Bush administration, we can't continue this change, and then yes we can all again, this was also
I campaigned for him. I went right out of the Republican Party. I was still a Republican, still am today, but I campaigned for Barack Obama.
We gave
And
him a Nobel Peace Prize because of his wonderful speeches. We fell
that
for it
that
as well, I guess.
that
Yeah.
became that became his single mark of positive nature. He could give a good speech. But I will say, when I met with him in the Roosevelt Room in November 2015, which would have been the last year of his second term, the first words out of his mouth to me and General Paul Eaton, who was sitting to my left, were, "There's a bias in this town toward war."
Yeah.
And then he gave us a disquisition on how he got essentially talked into doing Libya by, he didn't say this, but we knew it, two ladies, Samantha Power and Hillary Clinton. And John Kerry was sitting right beside him, his then Secretary of State. And we asked ourselves, General Eaton and I, when we walked out into the West Wing reception room, we just had a photo op with him in the Oval Office. We walked out of the West Wing reception room and we said, was he talking to us, to John Kerry, or himself? And the general looked at me and said, I think all three. I said, I think you're right. I think you're right. Because Kerry at that moment, you may recall, was advocating for U.S. ground forces in Syria. And so the president took that opportunity to not only say he'd learned something in 7 years, there's a bias in this town toward war, you bet, Mr. President, but he also was telling Kerry to shut his mouth in that indirect way in that meeting. And you could tell it from John Kerry's face. So Obama got fooled by a lot of people, and he got fooled, I think, most profoundly by his own confidence in himself, and it didn't work. I saw the same thing happen to Powell. Powell thought that he could handle anything, and he found out he couldn't.
So Obama was not optimistic about Libya, but it was Samantha Power and Hillary Clinton that swayed him.
I think that was the import of what he was saying. You remember he dispatched Samantha to the UN and got her out of Washington. And of course, John Kerry became the Secretary of State. I don't think he was happy with either one. I think he thought they had sold him a bill of goods, especially with regard to Libya. And those remarks that Hillary made rankle with him as much as they did with me, because we talked offline. We saw, he died. I said those are the most impolitic diplomatic remarks I'd ever heard uttered by an American supposed diplomat.
Yeah, accompanied by that chuckle, of course.
Yeah.
No, that was not
I think she had rehearsed those lines. I think
Yeah.
she was fully intent on saying that somewhere powerful in her interview.
appearing like an Iron Lady, perhaps. I'm not sure where she was going with this.
Well, she was running for president. She'd been running for president ever since she left the first ladyship. And, I had to deal with her to a certain extent when I would go to the wrap-up meetings at the State Department, because the Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, Paul Kelly, was a good friend of mine, former Marine, good friend of mine. So I would go to the wrap-up meetings when I could in the evenings, 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and I would listen to what his deputy secretary said about the Senate and the House. And I would listen to the deputy for the Senate talk about how Hillary Clinton was one of the people in the Senate who could cross the aisle and deal with the other side very effectively. And I got this impression that, well, maybe she's a pretty good senator. And then later on in that time, about a year and a half later, I began to listen a little closer to what Jim was saying about the Senate. And I began to understand that she was on her track. She was running for president. And I think she got the blow of her life when she didn't get elected.
But I remember there were also being stories, it was in the New York Times, about the Obama. He wanted to withdraw from the wars, I think Iraq especially. But then his appointees from I forgot which think tank, which dominated his administration.
Center for New American Security.
Yeah, that they were able to sway him into continuing that war as well. Did you have any insights on this?
Well, one reason they did it, Glenn, was because they knew what we were doing to build ISIS. We made ISIS. We made Daesh. We took out Abu Zarqawi. We took him out. He was the main man. What flowed into his death was Iraqi Sunni leadership, mostly from the Iraqi Republican Guard, who knew about artillery, knew about armored warfare, knew about how to coordinate air power. They were military, and they were pretty competent military. They were made incompetent in many respects by the leadership of Saddam Hussein and how he orchestrated and kept them on a leash all the time. But they weren't that bad a military, and they had good Soviet equipment. Well, what they did was make a deal with the CIA and with these remnants of, well, it was everything from Al Qaeda to you name it. It was a throw together group of terrorists that Zarqawi had put. Zarqawi was a poison maker up in the mountains, and suddenly he came down. I think he was a Kurd, if I remember right. Anyway, he came down, and Saddam Hussein didn't even like him. He was so bad. I learned all of this when I was getting Powell ready for the UN presentation. And they put together this organization that was going to, when the U.S. got out of Iraq in a way that they could, going to take Syria, going to take northern Iraq, going to, everything, the caliphate. They wanted a caliphate. Well, that was not what the Republican Guard members wanted. When you saw these guys firing accurate artillery rounds, when you saw them maneuvering tanks and everything, those weren't people who'd come from Al Qaeda or some other terrorist organization. Those are Republican Guard members from Iraq. So the CIA helped create that entity and flowed them into Syria so that we could destabilize Assad. We got a shock when the insurgency started in Iraq. The full plan was to go on to Syria. And the military thought that Assad would back down immediately. All we'd have to do would be roll a few tanks across the border and he'd back down because he'd seen what happened to Saddam Hussein. Well, the insurgency developed so fast, Rumsfeld had to nix that. So we didn't go on to Syria. Wes Clark will tell you that we were going to Syria and then to run, and maybe some places else too. But all I ever heard was the briefing on Syria. And I also heard the briefing when we stood down. We weren't going into Syria and part of that was because Tommy Franks had not listened to Colin when Colin had told him, you need at least 250,000 troops. And if you're going to do all this, you need at least 250,000 troops. And you had the experience of the first Gulf War, where we had 600,000 plus. A lot of other people played in that one, including the Syrians and the French and the Saudis. And Tommy finally got angry at Colin, and he said back to him, listen, Rumsfeld was going to give me 50,000 total. I'm glad I got 160,000. And then Rumsfeld left that division hanging out there in the ocean for so long, 16,000 men, that was going to come down through Turkey, but the Turks balked at the last minute and said, no, you can't do that. You can't come in from the north. So we had to ship them around, and they stayed at sea for a long time. Rumsfeld wouldn't let them come ashore because he wanted to be seen as the man who'd done Saddam Hussein with as few troops as possible, and then do Bashar al-Assad too, because it was all shock and awe. It didn't work. And so there we were, thumb in mouth, and no Syria going, and we developed an insurgency with the CIA. And long story short, we had to go back and fight our own developments. It was so bad, Glenn, that we actually had Marines shooting at CIA officers and CIA officers shooting at Marines in Syria because the one didn't know the other one was doing what they were doing. And the CIA was working with Al Qaeda too.
When did they get out of control, though? Because I can see, the American intelligence agencies building up these jihadist groups as an instrument in a proxy war. But when did the U.S., I guess, lose control over them and begin to attack them?
Well, when we had to come back, and they looked like they were going to make some significant progress, and we didn't think David Petraeus had told the president again and again and again that his training, remember, he started out as a 2-star, as the head of Minstiki, the training command in Iraq. And he was telling the president on civets almost every week that everything was copacetic, that all these people were getting really well trained, and they were going to be capable of not only internal security, but also external security for Iraq. This in progress to our leaving eventually. Well, I was getting reports from my spy on the ground in Iraq that the AWOL rate in these battalions was sometimes as high as 30%. And I was getting other reports that said they couldn't shoot straight and they weren't all that good as soldiers. So, well, Petraeus was giving glowing reports back to the president. So we thought that the military Petraeus had been largely responsible for training and given such glowing reports to the president about was going to be able to handle whatever was left of any insurgency or whatever. And I'm not even sure the conventional military, the right hand, knew what the CIA, the left hand, was doing completely. So we had to go back because they became ground taking and ground holding units. And so we had to get, Obama had no choice. He had to send forces back into Iraq because the Iraqi army couldn't handle it. And they begged him to come back, which was really kind of rare. They wanted us out, and then to beg us to come back, that meant that they really did understand that their military was not competent to handle that. I mean, you're talking about a bunch of people who got together, trained a little bit, Republican Guard behind them and helping them, lots of equipment, lots of ammunition, lots of artillery and everything. But still, Iraq had the equivalent, but they were frightened. And so they called us back in again, and we've been there pretty much ever since. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare, and it's partly a nightmare because the empire doesn't know what it's doing from day one to day two. It's got so many people involved in the soup that it doesn't have any time to eat the soup.
So, do you have any information now on the ground what's going on in Syria? Because this is, I guess, the United States, wanted to use Jolani and his henchmen to put pressure and weaken the position of Assad. But did they really want him to end up where he's now, ruling over Syria? This is, I mean, can he be civilized or managed? This seems like such a the way he was, have a bounty on his head, and next day, we go to, to cheer him on for creating a new democratic Syria. It's just it becomes very cartoonish after a while. Like this can't have been their first pick, I guess.
Some indication of how chaotic this was going to be occurred when Israel was really taking some losses, but nonetheless pounding Hezbollah. And all of a sudden, Netanyahu was asked by us to stop and to get ready for other action. And that other action, of course, was, and we told him this, was Syria. He was more than happy to do that. So he put an economy of force, holding force type element into Lebanon. And anyway, the ceasefire was coming about at that time, partly because of this. And he plunged into Syria. So we thought that Netanyahu, coveting as much of Syria as he possibly could get his hands on, and he was pushing well beyond the ski resort, the Mount Hermon, I think it's called, whatever, and well beyond the Golan that was already occupied into the southern Golan and on into Lake, River, Reservoir, and other places that he was investing because they want water. They want water wherever they can find it. That's one reason they want to stay in Lebanon. So Netanyahu joined the fray and became our tool in Syria to counter Erdogan because we were really worried about, and we were talking to Erdogan, but we were worried about what he was doing and what he was saying in the talks. He was saying that all he wanted to do is take care of that element of the Kurdish population in Syria that was giving him trouble. And then he would be happy. He'd be pleased and he wouldn't invest Syria anymore with troops. And Netanyahu was concerned too. You may recall Netanyahu and Erdogan met to talk about it. I'm not sure what they determined, but I think they gave themselves a division of labor, and Israel said it would continue to bomb everything that even looked like it might be a piece of ordnance in Syria, including in Damascus, which they've done several times. And they would take care of anything that needed to be taken care of if this guy moved in a way that looked like he was going to be inimical to either Erdogan's or Israel's interests, which Israel has done. They've had a couple of pretty vicious firefights with the IDF. His troops have. In each case, his troops have given a good showing, but they've been defeated by the IDF with some significant casualties. That's one reason Trump is pulling us out, But you'll note that he said he was pulling us out 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we still aren't gone. We still got about 1,000 troops there, and they're kind of lingering. But it's a mess. Syria's a mess, but Israel is making hay in that mess. And I suspect you're not going to see Israel, if it stays together as a state, which is becoming increasingly a question, never leaving Syria again. They'll have quite a significant stretch of water-rich territory inside Syria, beyond the Golan Heights.
So when before the Turkish-backed jihadists invaded Syria, this peace deal, which was all a ceasefire, which was reached between Israel and Lebanon or Hezbollah. This was, you're saying this was coordinated with the United States?
Yes, it was. If you remember, Lloyd Austin was standing on the border with his equivalent in the IDF. I forget the general's name now, but he was standing there and he was saying, this is going to stop. We're going to have a ceasefire, and we're going to have delineated lines and all this, and this will no longer be a component that diverts Israeli soldiers from other things that they need to do, meaning Gaza, I guess. And then I found out that Austin didn't necessarily lie, but he knew that that wasn't the case, because he knew what was going to happen, and he knew that the ceasefire was coming about because we wanted Israel to, protect our six, as Assad was either toppled or fought fiercely back. And that was the reason that the ceasefire came about as quickly as it did, not because Austin and Netanyahu wanted it to, but because they wanted to divert forces.
This is fascinating. I just had a bit of a sidetrack. You mentioned earlier that the United States were pushing hard for Sweden and Finland to be, well, to abandon their neutrality. How long was, again, they were neutral throughout the Cold War, and their military, especially in Sweden, they always, they were leaning towards wanting NATO membership, but both the population of Sweden and Finland were always,
Right.
well, the majority was not in favor. How has
We knew that, and we started major efforts. They're still ongoing in countries like
when did it start, or and how was this done, the efforts?
It started in 2002. It started in my administration, and it started with a vengeance with Jens Stoltenberg. We wanted Jens Stoltenberg to be the new Secretary General of NATO, and we were absolutely committed to that.
Why?
Because we knew he was our man. We knew he was going to do what we wanted him to do. We knew he was in mind meld with us about NATO expansion. We're talking about eventually probably every country that we would say is geographically in Europe, no matter how small, no matter how criminal, no matter how undemocratic, every single country in Europe was going to be a member of NATO. And we needed a whole new game with regard to those who were holdouts, either for neutrality or just simply didn't have a population that wanted to be a member of NATO. So we started doing what we do in what we call color revolutions. They were orchestrated within the countries. Each country had its package, and that package consisted of everything from non-governmental organizations to quahogs, quasi-governmental organizations, to government organizations, political visits from senators and representatives. That was a big part of the campaign. And they focused all of these things clandestinely and openly, like the visits by Senate and House delegations, focused on those people within the country that wanted to comply with our wishes, wanted their country to be a member of NATO, no matter how long they'd been neutral, perhaps, like in the case of some of the Scandinavians, wanted their country to be a vassal of the United States in order to get the stars on their shoulders and the tanks and the F-35s and all the other stuff. And it was very successful. We only failed, in my view, we only failed with 1 or 2 countries that we had on the top of the target list, principally because, and this is my guess on it, principally because the communist legacy was not like it was in other countries that had been behind the Iron Curtain, nor was it something that scared the Scandinavians or other countries that hadn't been behind the Iron Curtain. In one or two countries, it did that, and you got real welcome for NATO membership. In other countries, it didn't. I would say Viktor Orban in Hungary and maybe Slovakia are two of those countries where there wasn't this feeling that we've been under the yoke of the Soviet Union. We now don't want to be under the yoke of the Russians because they're no different. They just call themselves differently. And so we don't want that. And that made Poland, for example, and others want to be members of NATO, desperately want to be members of NATO, want to be dominant members of NATO. Some of these other countries didn't. So we lost on a couple that we tried this in. But we tried it in every one of them. It worked famously in Montenegro. It worked famously in Albania. I said to Powell, why do we want criminal states in NATO? Albania is it's a criminal state. Montenegro steals more automobiles than are stolen in the United States. What the hell are we doing? How can they pass NATO's credentials for membership? I don't know, he said. But we did. We brought them in, and we orchestrated these campaigns to get what I call tyrannies of the minority. We found the political minority, not the political majority, that wanted NATO membership, desperately wanted NATO membership, and we backed it to the hill. We bought newspapers, we bought magazines, we bought articles, we bought same thing we did in Italy in 1948 when we didn't want the communists to be elected. We bought the Italian government. We bought the Iranian government in 1953. We bought the government in, where was it? Guatemala in 1954, and on and on and on. Well, this was much more sophisticated. This is not CIA agents per se doing this. This is CIA orchestrated campaigns that are run by non-governmental organizations, sometimes wittingly and sometimes unwittingly. It's what we use for Georgia, for example. It's what we're using right now in Georgia, trying to get the current government eked into its political leadership, and then we're trying to get them kicked out. And we're trying to get the government that was there before back in, because they're the ones who want to, stand up to Russia, be a member of NATO, and so forth. But this government that's in right now is very balanced. They want a good relationship with the EU, good relationship with Washington, good relationship with NATO, and a good relationship with Moscow. We don't like that, so we're trying to get them overthrown. That's how we do business today. We don't do business with direct action. We do business with direct action through NGOs and others who, as I said, are sometimes witting and sometimes unwitting. The ones associated with the Republican Institute are most often witting.
And I guess the National Endowment for Democracy would be one of these key NGOs.
That's a big one. That's a big one.
Yeah.
NED. And you got others too that you don't even think are doing this sort of thing, like FDD. And they're doing it, of course, on behalf of not just the United States, but also on behalf of Israel. Because this is all kind of locked in to where you get multiple parties participating in the planning and the propagandizing. For example, Mossad and the CIA together. You better believe Mossad's in Ukraine.
And was this also the approach towards Ukraine? I mean, we don't even have to go to 2014, but even back in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, because this was done quite blatantly. I remember Yushchenko then back then he even called the EU and the godfather of the Orange Revolution. You had a lot of the interference was quite open, and I guess the Rose Revolution in Georgia 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, they were quite extraordinary because there were genuine discontent which could be tapped into on the ground. I mean, there's corruption, democratic deficits, a lot of reasons why you would demonstrate against the government, but the willingness to join NATO, every polling put it about 20%. Nobody wanted to be a part of NATO, but any discontent about corruption, whatever, was hijacked for a very geopolitical objective, which was let's join NATO and against the Russians. But the vast majority of Ukrainians, they preferred to have security arrangements with the Russians, not with NATO. This was, and it was just an extraordinary, yeah, thing to happen. But again, in this media as well, in this country, it was all sold back then as being a huge, yeah, democratic development. But it's a democratic revolution. Of course, it failed because the Ukrainians never wanted that government. And then we had 2014 again, 10 years later, do the exact same thing, but of course more vicious, purging old opposition. But what were your experiences from 2004, the whole Rose Revolution, sorry, Orange Revolution in Ukraine?
I had a CIA agent tell me, Larry, there's never been a weapon or a tool or an instrument of national policy as potent as us now, because we have liberal democracy on our side. Now, think about that for a minute. They had weaponized liberal democracy, and they used all these institutes and other people who were vested heavily in what they were doing, country by country, to implement liberal democracy. And as he said, it is a very powerful weapon, probably the most powerful weapon we've ever picked up. And I think that was a description with nuances all across Europe of what we were doing and what we're still doing. As I said, in Georgia, we just messed up in Romania. We didn't mess up, we succeeded. We got Colin Georgescu out. He was the one who preliminarily looked like he was going to be the new Romanian leader. So we got him out. He's gone. I don't know exactly how we did it, but I know we did it because someone called me and told me they were going to do it, and we did it. And he was gone. I was on that week, I was supposed to call him to talk to him because a person I know really well knows him really well, and he was getting real cold feet. And he wanted me to talk to him and to try and beef him up. And I said, what the hell am I going to say to, I don't know him from Adam. How am I going to beef him up in terms of his staying around? Well, he says, well, they're going to destroy him. They're going to get him. I knew they were going to get him, and they got him. That's, were they doing that in 2004 in Ukraine? They didn't have to be quite that straightforward about getting rid of people in 2004. But yes, we were running people from European command down into Ukraine as early as 2005 and 2006 to begin to work with, ready for this, the Azov battalions and others like that, in order to ensure that we were operationally capable of melding intelligence and arms and other things. And we even had a 4-star general who liked to ride big bikes, Harleys in particular, who occasionally would, as a 4-star general, get on his bike and go riding and do coordinating. This was all happening before the really tense period of 2014 when, we took sides so blatantly it was pitiful. We were working on it all along.
But some of this instrument for regime change or color revolutions, as they were called, has some of this been dismantled now? Because Trump, he had this defunding.
That's a huge question.
Yeah,
that's a huge question. I asked the other day if Tulsi as DNI and Ratcliffe, I was told Ratcliffe is in on all this. He's in favor of everything that's going on. So I said, well, you're telling me Tulsi's not and Ratcliffe is? How the hell is she going to turn him around? No answer. If Ratcliffe is neocon par excellence or whatever he is, but is intent on keeping all of these things going come hell or high water, and boy, do I know about the CIA keeping things going when the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense don't even know they're doing it. That's the common practice now. And the director will come back and say, well, we've got to give the president plausible deniability. You mean you're killing people without the sanction of the President of the United States in a formal decision memorandum, in a presidential finding or something? You're killing people on the ground in a foreign country? No comment. And it goes on from president to president because the president doesn't have any clarity on what's happening on the ground with the CIA, and the CIA has become its own independent actor within the national security establishment. And people warned about this. People warned about this when we created the DNI too, and thought the DNI would be the person that would, consolidate power and be uncontrollable by the president. But the DNI has never been given money and people power. Trump promised to do that with Tulsi, but as far as I know, he hasn't done that yet. If you don't have money, if you don't have control over the budget, and the black budget too, and you don't have control over people, that is, you can't move people per their cleverness, their talent, their agility, whatever, from the CIA to INR at state, or from INR at state to the DNI or office or staff or the CIA or whatever. If you can't do that, then how powerful are you? If all you can do is pontificate, how powerful are you? Now, Trump promised to give Tulsi, because she knew that, and she made it a condition of her hiring for the position, that he give her money and people power. And I have seen no indication of that. Ratcliffe is doing whatever the hell he wants to do, and Tulsi's not really supervising. And what Ratcliffe is doing is anything but, I think, what Trump would have him doing, were Trump to be aware of it. So we've just got a colossal mess is what we've got, a typical kind of mess when an empire gets to the end. And no one knows how to control it. No one knows how to stick their finger into the pie and say, nope, pull that cherry out, go away. You can't do it anymore, because it's gotten too big and too out of control, and too much money flowing into it. Money, incidentally, that's only coming from the printing presses. Ain't nothing behind it.
That's just amazing.
It is amazing. Man, I tell you, as I said, I learned as much from my students, if not more, in their case studies, over 400 of them. We studied everything from the Korean War up to the Obama's incursion into Lebanon. Do you know that Norwegian F-16 pilots led the bombing of Lebanon? Or not Lebanon.
Sorry.
Libya? Norwegian F-16 pilots led the bombing of Libya.
Yeah, I think we dropped 10% of the bombs on Libya. We got 5 million people, but that was good. That was good for promoting Jens Stoltenberg.
One of them was interviewed in my presence. I can't talk about anything more than that, but he was interviewed in my presence. He was so a young guy, good-looking guy, young guy, F-16 pilot, as I recall. But he was so excited that he finally dropped bombs on live human beings. I'm thinking to myself, man, you think that's an accomplishment? You're Norwegian and you think that's an accomplishment? Dropping bombs on live human beings? Okay, all right. I guess that's the way the Air Force thinks.
Yeah, I think at the time there was some reports in the media that he had told the Swedish Prime Minister that this was a great exercise, a good way to test the military, that they should be getting in on this. But I've always been curious to what extent did the involvement of Norway in Libya back in 2011 helped to boost him into the position of being the NATO Secretary General. Was it the interventionism that put him in favor in Washington, or was it also, I guess, his support for NATO expansionism?
I think it started pretty early. As I recall, he was instrumental in getting us political support from not just one or two countries. I think it was 4 or 5 countries that helped us get political support post 9/11 for what we were doing. We had this colossal chart we drew up after 9/11, and what it had was diplomatic and other missions across the top, countries down the left side, and in each little square thus created was a corner. And what it said was, Denmark will provide political support, and our ambassador will take care of getting that. Germany will provide this and that, and the Secretary of State will take care of that. Pakistan will require the president to make a phone call and the Secretary of State or the deputy to visit Islamabad, because we need overflight rights, we need passage rights, we need help with logistics. And Uzbekistan. So This thing had every country in the world on it, and every ambassador and every cabinet officer who would implement whatever the president said to do with regard to that country that needed to come above the ambassador. And it included military assistance, it included political support, all things. And we really got some great support out of Jens Stoltenberg in that process. So it was building. It was building for quite a while. I would say post 9/11, roughly a year or so, because it took us a while to get that matrix out there and everybody working on it. But probably I'd say at least 2003 forward, it was going bangers, and we were identifying people all along the way. We were casting some of them aside because we said, no, that woman or that guy is not the kind of person we need. Okay, mark that one off. Let's go after this person or that person. And people were on the ground doing this, and our ambassadors, our country teams were doing it. Sometimes, Powell would be the instructor. Sometimes the CIA would be the instructor. Sometimes DOD would be the instructor, as it were. But Powell tried to keep a hand on it, and he tried to understand what was happening in the country team. A lot of, I don't know if you know this, but our country teams have every element of our bureaucracy in them. And the bigger ones have multiple members of that bureaucracy. So for example, you have a station chief maybe for the CIA and all manner of people under diplomatic cover working for the CIA. Often the ambassador in that country and the country team in general, who are civilians, if you will, they don't know what the CIA is doing out of their embassy. Often the conventional military commander who has that particular country in his area of responsibility does not know what the CIA is doing in their AOR. So it's extremely complicated. And Powell was sometimes aware of what was going on, and sometimes we weren't aware of what was going on. If George Tenet decided he didn't want Powell to know about it, Powell didn't know about it. And that continues apace today. If the CIA doesn't want the ambassador and the country team other than his station chief to know what's going on in Pakistan, then they don't. Now, the CIA director sometimes will say, I don't want the ambassador to have to lie. Because if the ambassador's briefed in on this operation, and then he's asked a question by the press, he's either going to have to say he can't answer the question, which no ambassador wants to do, or he's going to have to lie. We don't want him to have to lie, so we're not going to tell him about it. That's a hell of an excuse to keep your country team in the dark about something that you're doing in his country that might have severe repercussions if it becomes public. But that's the way it went. And we really worked on Europe. I mean, we worked on Europe. When people ask me, why is Europe so heavily invested in this Ukraine business, I say, well, we got them that way. This is a war between Washington and Moscow, not Kyiv and Moscow. Kyiv is the instrument of our war.